The first time Elena Carter realized her family had stopped seeing her as a person, it happened at her own mother's birthday dinner. Her father stood at the head of the table with a glass of bourbon in one hand and a forced smile on his face, while her aunt, her uncle, and both of her younger cousins watched in that special kind of silence people use when they are waiting for someone else to be humiliated. 32, her father said, lifting his glass toward her. And still no husband, no kids, and no real job. A few people laughed, politely at first. Then a little louder when they saw Elena didn't. Her mother gave a nervous smile from the other end of the table. "Frank, don't start." "I'm not starting anything," he said. "I'm stating facts. Elena lives in my house, eats my food, and spends her days working from home on that little computer of hers. Meanwhile, her sister has a husband, a mortgage, and a baby on the way. That's what a grown woman looks like." Elena set down her fork very carefully. "I pay rent." He waved a hand. "Barely." "That's enough, Frank," her grandmother said quietly. But her father wasn't done. He turned to the room like he was delivering closing arguments in a case he had already won. "All I'm saying is that some women are built for family, and some are built for excuses. Elena has spent years pretending she's building something important, but all I see is a woman who's afraid of reality." The room got awkwardly still. Her sister, Tasha, looked down at her plate. Her brother-in-law stared at his water glass. Her aunt made a soft, uncomfortable noise, and suddenly became fascinated with the centerpiece. Elena felt the heat rise in her face, but she didn't speak. She had learned long ago that in her family, defending herself only made people lean in harder. Then her father slid an envelope across the table. "It's time we stop pretending this can go on forever," he said. "You meet Daniel Ross next Friday. He's a decent man. His family owns 3 dealerships, and he's ready to settle down. If you're smart, you'll say yes." Elena looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "You invited me here to set me up on a date?" "I invited you here because I'm trying to save your life." "No," Elena said, her voice low and calm. "You invited me here because you're embarrassed that your daughter won't sit still and disappear into somebody else's marriage." Her father's smile vanished. At the far end of the house, Elena's phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again. She glanced down automatically, expecting her assistant to be rescheduling meetings or her technical lead to be panicking over a server issue. Instead, the screen lit up with a name she had never expected to see. The number belonged to a major financial news network. She stood so fast her chair scraped the hardwood floor. "Excuse me," she said. Her father let out a dry laugh. "There she goes again. Important calls from imaginary companies." Elena walked out of the dining room without answering him. Her hands were suddenly cold, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She stepped into the hallway, lifted the phone, and said, "This is Elena." A voice on the other end came back breathless and excited. "Miss Carter, sorry to call you directly, but we've just received confirmation. North Star is live. Your launch was picked up by 3 national outlets in the last 10 minutes. TechWire is calling it one of the most promising women-led startups of the year." Elena closed her eyes. For 3 years, she had worked in silence. While her family called her lazy, while her father accused her of wasting her life, while cousins asked if she was still doing that computer thing, she had been building something from nothing in the basement of a rented duplex on the edge of the city. North Star wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a side project. It was a platform that could cut fraud and automate financial recovery for small businesses that had been buried by predatory lenders and bad accounting systems. It had nearly broken her twice. It had cost her sleep, friends, one relationship, and almost her sanity. And now it was about to change everything. The reporter kept talking. "Your investor call is at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Also, there's a request from a national morning show." Elena could barely hear the rest. Through the thin walls of the hallway, she heard her father mutter, "Still playing secret CEO." She smiled for the first time in months. "Tell them I'll be there," she said. Then she walked back into the dining room, looked her father straight in the eye, and said, "You were right about one thing. It is time to stop pretending." Her father raised an eyebrow. "Finally." Elena placed her phone on the table, and the screen lit up with another incoming message. A headline preview flashed across it before anyone could look away. The breakout startup shaking up small business finance was built by a woman her family called a failure. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt physical. Her father's face changed first. Not fear exactly, more like irritation at being confronted with something he couldn't control. Her mother put a hand over her mouth. Tasha blinked at the phone, then at Elena. "What is that?" Elena looked around the table at the same people who had spent years treating her like a burden. "It's my company," she said. "And tonight, it's worth more than all of your opinions combined." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time in her life, Elena didn't feel small. She felt dangerous. Before that night, people in the Carter family knew Elena as the quiet one, the unmarried one, the one who missed family barbecues and showed up late to birthdays, the one who always had some excuse about work, even though nobody had ever seen a real office badge or a real boss. They knew her as the daughter who lived in the same neighborhood, but somehow never seemed available for anything that mattered to them. What they didn't know was that Elena had been building North Star out of pure stubbornness and old pain. At 29, she had the kind of face that made strangers assume she was gentler than she was. Dark brown eyes, thick hair usually tied back without effort, a voice that was soft until it wasn't. She had been the top student in her business program, the one with the scholarship offer and the internship that could have led anywhere. Then her father had had a stroke, her mother had panicked, and Elena, being the responsible one, had put her ambitions on hold to help manage the household, the bills, and her father's recovery. When she got back on her feet, the world expected her to shrink into the role she had temporarily occupied. Take care of the home. Find a decent man. Be grateful. Elena tried for a while to do what they wanted. She dated a lawyer her aunt approved of. She attended church fundraisers. She smiled through comments about her clock ticking. Then she realized the clock everybody kept talking about was not hers. It belonged to the people desperate to see her stop trying. North Star began as a notebook idea during one winter when she was helping a friend's bakery recover from a payroll scam. The business had almost collapsed because of one employee's quiet theft and a bank that refused to help. Elena saw how many small owners were vulnerable because they didn't have expensive legal teams or accountants. She started sketching software that could flag financial inconsistencies, recover lost income, and connect small businesses to no-nonsense compliance support. At first, it was just code in a basement. Then it became a prototype, then a pilot that didn't fail. She worked nights after everyone in the house went to sleep. She took calls in her car when she needed privacy. She ate too many drive-through meals and lived on coffee so strong it could have stripped paint. One of the earliest investors ghosted her. Another laughed in her face when he heard she was unmarried and living with her parents. "Family money is distracting," he had said, not even bothering to hide his smirk. "Women your age usually settle down before they try building companies." Elena had stood up, thanked him, and never spoken to him again. She didn't tell her family because she already knew how they would respond. Her father would call it unstable. Her aunt would call it embarrassing. Her mother would tell her to be careful. Tasha would try to be supportive, but would eventually let something slip in front of the wrong person. And then there was Victor. Victor Carter was Elena's older brother, the family's favorite son by default. He was charming in the way some people are when they've never had to earn forgiveness. He ran a real estate company that was mostly inherited confidence, a polished smile, and a whole lot of borrowed money. On paper, he was successful. In reality, he had the attention span of a man watching a stock ticker from a hot tub. He also had a habit of showing up whenever Elena was close to something good. When Elena's prototype finally began attracting attention, Victor started asking casual questions. "How much is the software worth? Who's investing? Are you signing anything official?" He sounded interested, supportive even. Elena ignored the warning signs because family made people trust too much and think too little. That was her mistake. 3 months before the launch, Victor came to her one evening with a problem. He had gotten overextended on a development deal and needed a temporary bridge loan. "Just until the condos sell," he said. "You know Dad's been tight since the hospital bills. Help me out, and I'll pay you back before the quarter ends." Elena refused. Not because she didn't love him, but because she had seen the numbers and knew the deal was rotten. That was when Victor smiled. patted her shoulder, and said, "You're always so intense. No wonder you're still single." The sentence landed harder than it should have, because it came from inside the family, from the one person who knew exactly where to push. Then, 2 weeks later, a copy of Elena's project outline somehow ended up in a pitch meeting Victor attended with one of his contacts. Someone on the other side of the table asked if he had any connection to the work being described. Victor had looked at the materials, then looked at the investor, and said, "My sister has been tinkering with something. Nothing serious." Nothing serious. Elena found out when the investor canceled her follow-up call. By then, Victor had already started hinting around the neighborhood that Elena had been playing CEO with his business contacts and overstating her role. That was the second reason she kept working in silence. Because when your own family has a talent for rewriting your story, success becomes a private language. The morning after the birthday dinner, Elena woke before dawn to 6 missed calls from her mother and 13 messages from her father, all ranging between confusion and outrage. The news had spread overnight. By 8 a.m., North Star was on 2 morning shows and a business podcast. By 9:15, a regional bank had requested a private demo. By lunchtime, a major venture group out of New York wanted to discuss a Series A round that would value the company in the tens of millions. By early afternoon, Elena's email was so full of requests that her assistant had to start screening them in batches. And by evening, her father had invited himself to her apartment. He arrived without knocking, still wearing his work shirt and the expression he usually saved for mechanics who charged him too much. "Is it true?" he asked. Elena was standing at her kitchen counter, reviewing a legal packet. "Hello to you too." He ignored that. "Are you really the woman on the news?" "I am. If you're asking about North Star." His jaw tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked up at him. "Why didn't you ask if anything in my life mattered beyond whether I had a husband?" "That's not fair. Neither was anything you said at your birthday dinner." He walked farther into the apartment, scanning everything like he was trying to see through the walls. "So you've been hiding money from your family?" Elena laughed once, sharply. "That's your first concern? Of course it is. You live in this family. We support each other." "You support me?" She shut the folder and turned fully toward him. "Dad, I paid Mom's medication bill for 6 months when your savings were tied up. I helped Victor cover a late tax penalty. I fixed Tasha's credit report when her ex put a loan in her name. I've been supporting this family since I was 25, and nobody called it support because I was the daughter." He stared at her, the old reflex of control colliding with the new reality that she had receipts. Then his face changed again, and Elena saw it clearly. Not pride, not apology, calculation. "How much is it worth?" he asked. There it was, the same look Victor wore, the same tone. The family, suddenly remembering Elena existed only because something useful had attached itself to her. "Enough?" Elena said. "Enough for what?" "For you to stop asking me like I owe you a percentage." Her father exhaled through his nose. "You're dramatic." "I learned from the best." He took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. If this thing is real, then your family needs to be involved. Your brother has experience. Your mother should have been part of the planning. And this business, this name Carter, means something. It can't just belong to you alone." Elena stared at him. He had not said, "I'm proud of you." He had said, "We need to be involved." "Did Victor put you up to this?" His silence was answer enough. Elena felt something inside her go colder than anger. "Get out. Don't be childish. Get out of my apartment." He folded his arms. "I'm your father. And I'm the reason you're standing in an apartment you thought was a hobby." For a long second, he looked like he might argue. Instead, he made the mistake of reaching for the folder on the counter. Elena moved faster than he expected and took a step back. "What's that?" he demanded. "Legal paperwork." "About the company?" "About the people who won't touch it now." His brow furrowed. "Meaning?" Elena met his eyes. "Meaning I've already started the process to separate my business assets from family interference." The color drained slightly from his face. "You'd cut us out?" "You already cut me out years ago. You just didn't realize I was still in the room." He left 15 minutes later, slamming the door hard enough to shake the frame. She thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, Victor called. He sounded almost wounded. You made Dad look like an idiot. He managed that part himself. Elena, come on. You know how he is. He was proud and got weird. Proud? She repeated. That's what you're calling it? He's trying. No, Victor. He's trying to own what I built. Victor sighed like she was the unreasonable one. You always take everything so personally. We're family. Why are you acting like this is a war? Elena leaned against the counter and looked out the window at the rising city skyline. Because you turned it into one. He was quiet for a moment. Then his tone shifted into the smooth, persuasive voice he used when he needed something. I'm serious. We should talk business. I can help. I know people. You don't want investors thinking this is just some lone woman's passion project. They want structure. They want a family office angle. If we present it right, everybody wins. There is no we. There can be. No, Victor, there can't. He laughed lightly, but there was an edge under it now. You're making a mistake. She almost told him about the board meeting, about the lawyer she had retained, about the quiet due diligence already happening because a major fund had noticed a suspicious pattern around one of Victor's developments, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she said, you should be careful threatening the sister who knows where your money problems are. Victor went silent. That was when Elena knew he had something to hide. The next twist came from the one person in the family Elena still believed could be honest. Her grandmother, Ruth. Ruth Carter lived in a modest brick house on the west side of the city, the same house where Elena had spent nearly every summer growing up. Her grandmother had raised 3 children through layoffs, grief, and an ex-husband who vanished before he could become anyone's story. Ruth had a way of seeing through people's performances and calling things by their real names. When Elena arrived that Saturday, Ruth was already waiting on the porch with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who knew more than she had said. I saw your interview, Ruth said, handing Elena a cup. You looked like yourself and not like the family version of you. Elena gave a tired smile. That's probably the nicest thing anyone's said to me all week. Then your week has been full of fools. Elena laughed, and for a moment it felt like being able to breathe again. Ruth watched her carefully. Your father came here yesterday. Elena's posture changed. Of course he did. He asked me about your company. And? Ruth looked out at the street. And he said he wanted to make sure your inheritance was protected. Elena frowned. My inheritance? Ruth nodded once. He didn't tell you? Tell me what? Your grandfather left a trust. He had money from the hardware chain sale, and he put part of it in my name until I passed it on. There was always meant to be a distribution for you when you turned 32. Elena just stared. Ruth took a slow sip of tea. He changed the conversation quickly when I told him he wouldn't be controlling it. Elena set her cup down so carefully she was surprised it didn't crack. My father knows about this. Yes. And he never told me? Ruth's eyes sharpened. That would require him to share something he intended to manage himself. Elena stood very still. All this time, while her father had mocked her for living at home, while he had insisted she was a drain on the family, he had been keeping a secret inheritance from her. Why would he do that? Ruth's mouth pressed into a thin line. Because Victor's development company has debts. Serious ones. And because your father has been using family assets like they belong to him. Elena turned slowly back toward her grandmother. What kind of debts? Ruth didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, Elena understood she was about to hear something ugly. Then Ruth said, the kind that get people desperate. The trust documents changed everything. With Ruth's help, Elena discovered that her grandfather had indeed set aside a private inheritance intended to support the most prudent and industrious of the Carter grandchildren, wording that, at the time, had made everyone assume it would go to Victor. But the trust had a second clause. If one child showed exceptional independent enterprise, the trustee could direct the funds accordingly. Elena had not been told because her father had buried the paperwork in a family safe after her grandfather died. Buried it, then lied about it for years. Not only had he called her lazy, he had also withheld money that was legally hers because he thought she would never amount to enough to question him. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment with the papers spread across her table. Her hands shook with a kind of rage that felt almost clean. A line from the trust letter kept staring back at her. Not all inheritance is money. Sometimes it is proof. The proof landed harder than any insult ever had. By Monday morning, by Tuesday, the bank managing the family trust requested a review. By Wednesday, the first private investigator she hired sent back a preliminary report on Victor's finances. The report was a disaster. Victor had not just been overextended. He had been moving money between entities in ways that looked designed to disguise losses, inflate property values, and keep lenders from noticing how badly one of his projects had gone off the rails. One of the shell companies listed in the paperwork was tied to a former partner who had already been sued in another state for similar conduct. Elena read the report 3 times. It explained the pressure. It explained why her father had suddenly wanted her involved. It explained the casual way Victor kept circling back to her company, as if his own financial survival depended on getting a piece of it. He had not simply been envious. He had been hunting. The most painful part was how personal the theft felt. Victor had always been the brother who slapped her shoulder and told her to relax. The brother who teased her about being too serious. The brother who said he'd cover her when the family made comments about her single life. He had been smiling while he dug the knife in. Elena didn't confront him right away. She waited, because patience, she had learned, was often the only weapon underestimated women were allowed to keep. The opportunity came at the family's annual summer cookout, a tradition her mother insisted on keeping even after the family had long stopped acting like one. By then, the news had made North Star impossible to ignore. Elena had signed a significant investment deal with a women-led fund in New York. The company had secured interest from 3 major banks, and one national paper had run a profile about her as an example of the overlooked founder changing small business finance. Her father had started telling relatives he had always believed in her business sense. Victor, meanwhile, had shifted from smug to territorial. He arrived at the cookout in a new jacket, kissed Elena's cheek as if nothing had happened, and said, "You're making us all look good." Elena smiled the way people do when they are deciding whether to let a liar keep talking. The family gathered in the backyard around folding tables, grilled food, and fake smiles. Children ran through the grass. The adults took turns pretending the past month had not happened. Her mother hovered between people like a nervous referee. Ruth sat under a tree and observed everything without interfering. Then Victor stood with a beer in hand and clinked a spoon against his glass. "I want to say something," he announced. Elena knew exactly what was coming. Victor looked at the crowd and smiled. "First, congratulations to Elena. It's amazing what can happen when a person gets a little support. Our family has always valued entrepreneurship, and I think it's great that we're all finally seeing the reward of sticking together." A few people nodded. Her father looked proud, which was somehow worse than if he had looked guilty. Victor continued, "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to Elena about an expansion opportunity. We've got a few properties that could pair nicely with her platform. If she's open to it, I'd love for Carter Development and North Star to explore some strategic alignment." There it was again. Not partnership, alignment. As if he was saying the company belonged in the orbit of his life by right. Elena set down her cup. "Funny," she said, and her voice was calm enough that everyone turned. "Because I was about to talk about expansion too." Victor's smile didn't move. Great minds. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I've got a copy of the trust documents, the financial review, and the bank's preliminary notices. I thought the family might like to know that one of your properties is under investigation for fraudulent valuation claims." The backyard went silent. Victor's face changed so fast it was almost a physical thing. Her father shot up from his chair. "What are you talking about?" Elena opened the folder and held up the first page. "I'm talking about the money you hid from me. I'm talking about the inheritance Grandpa left me. I'm talking about the loans Victor took out against properties that don't match the numbers he's been reporting. And I'm talking about the fact that all of you have spent years telling me I was lazy while I was the only one in this family who was actually building something real." "That's enough," her father barked. "No," Elena said. "It's not." Victor put his beer down too quickly. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. You've been digging through private records?" "I hired professionals," Elena said. "The kind you couldn't intimidate." Her father's face darkened. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Am I?" Elena looked around the yard. Or are you just embarrassed because the daughter you laughed at is the one who can now prove everything you tried to hide? Tasha stood slowly, her eyes darting between them. Victor, what did you do? He turned on her. Nothing. She's angry because she thinks success makes her untouchable. Elena laughed once. No, Victor. I'm angry because you stole from me and then tried to cash in on my life. Stole? His voice rose. That's insane. Ruth stood from the shade of the tree. It isn't insane, it's documented. Every head turned. Her grandmother walked forward, cane tapping softly against the pavement. I saw the trust papers. Frank, I saw your signature requests. I saw the way you tried to keep Elena in the dark. And I saw the bank notices Victor never meant for the rest of you to read. Her father looked at Ruth in disbelief. Mom, stay out of this. No, Ruth said. I stayed out of it when you told people Elena was wasting her life. I stayed out of it when you let Victor borrow her dignity as if it were a family resource. I stayed out of it when you made a woman feel guilty for not getting married just to satisfy your need for appearances. I'm done staying out of it. Nobody had ever talked to Frank Carter that way in public. That was clear from the way his face drained and his hand curled into a fist. Elena saw it a second before it happened. He was going to lash out. Maybe at Ruth, maybe at her, maybe simply at the world for cornering him. But before he could move, her mother stepped between them. Don't, she said. And it was the first time Elena had heard steel in her mother's voice. Frank blinked, almost offended that the room had developed a conscience. He turned to Elena. What do you want? The question landed hard because it was the first honest thing he had said all day. Elena folded the papers once and put them back in the folder. I want my name back, she said. I want my inheritance released. I want Victor's dealings reviewed by people who actually understand fraud. I want an apology that doesn't come with conditions. And I want all of you to finally understand that I was never lazy. I was invisible to people who only respect what they can control. Victor let out a bitter laugh. So this is revenge? Elena looked at him for a long moment. No. Revenge would be ruining you the way you tried to ruin me. He went pale. This, she said, holding up the folder, is justice. The fallout happened fast. The bank froze Victor's most fragile accounts while the trust was reviewed. The outside audit confirmed multiple irregularities in his development company. One property had been overvalued by more than 30%. Another had liens he had failed to disclose. A third was tied to a contractor payment scheme that looked suspiciously like misappropriation. The civil side got ugly. Lenders began circling. A former business partner, apparently relieved to no longer be carrying the guilt alone, came forward with emails. Then someone leaked the investigation to the press, and the same outlets that had praised the Carter family's stability were now asking questions about the empire behind it. Victor tried to blame Elena. He told relatives she had gone after him because she was jealous. He claimed she had manipulated their grandmother. He even suggested the company headlines had gone to her head. Nobody believed him. Not after the receipts. Not after the audit. Not after one of his own employees sent Elena a private message saying Victor had been pressuring staff to misclassify vendor payments for months. Her father fared no better. The trust dispute forced open records that showed exactly how long he had hidden the inheritance and how often he had used family money like a private shield. The worst part wasn't the legal trouble. It was the moral collapse. People who had once envied his confidence now saw only a man who had spent years building authority out of other people's silence. Elena could have walked away entirely. A part of her wanted to, but then her mother called one evening, crying so hard Elena could barely understand her. He's not well, her mother kept saying. The stress, the humiliation, the calls from lawyers. He keeps saying you destroyed the family. Elena shut her eyes. No, Mom. I exposed what was already rotting. There was a long pause. Then her mother said something Elena never expected to hear. I think I was afraid of him for so long that I helped him without realizing it. It was not an apology. Not exactly. But it was the first real crack in a wall that had stood for decades. So Elena did what she always did when the room left her no choice. She handled the truth directly. She met her parents at the attorney's office. Victor didn't come. That alone told her he had finally run out of charm to spend. Her father looked smaller in the legal conference room than he ever had at home. Less like a patriarch and more like a man who had spent too long confusing volume with authority. His eyes were red. His hands trembled slightly when he picked up the settlement papers. "Elena," he said, and there was no performance in it this time. "I didn't think you'd really make it." She sat across from him. "That's the problem. Neither did you." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Elena waited. He looked down at the paper, then back at her. About a lot of things. It was the closest thing to accountability he had ever offered. Too late for some things, maybe, but not for all. Her mother's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, too." Elena had planned this moment in her head 100 times. In some versions, she shouted. In others, she walked out without a word. In one, she cried so hard she couldn't breathe, but standing there, looking at the people who had both loved and wounded her, she realized something important. Forgiveness was not the same thing as surrender. "I accept your apology," she said carefully, "but that doesn't mean things go back to how they were." Her father nodded once. "You're not moving back," he said. "No. And the money goes into my name, as the trust intended?" He looked pained, but he nodded again. "And Victor? We'll deal with the consequences of what he did." That answer cost her less than she thought it would, because Victor's consequences came from the world he had trusted too much. The lenders sued. The business partners distanced themselves. The state opened a formal review. One of his shell entities collapsed into a paper trail so messy it became impossible to hide the true scale of the deception. He was not sent to prison in a dramatic, cinematic way that would have made for easy satisfaction. Real life was less neat, but he lost money, credibility, and the thing he valued most, the illusion that people would keep covering for him. His marriage shattered under the weight of it. His wife, who had spent years believing his confidence meant stability, filed for separation after discovering loans in their joint accounts. The life he had built by pretending was steady came apart in the same way cheap furniture does once the screws are finally exposed. The family stopped inviting him to events. Nobody had to tell him why. As for Elena, the company grew. North Star closed its funding round 6 weeks later. Then came the contracts. Then came the partnerships with community banks and accounting firms. Then came the interviews, the awards, the panel invitations, the requests from women who had been dismissed in their own families and wanted to know how she had kept going. Elena never told them to be patient and wait for recognition. She told them the truth. "Keep proof," she said on one panel. "Keep records. Keep your own name on your work. And never let anybody convince you that being unmarried, unmarried at 30, unmarried at 40, or unmarried at all means your life is unfinished. Some people get married, some people build, some people do both. But nobody gets to define your value by how convenient you are to them." The line got quoted online more than once. Her father read it in the paper and didn't comment. Her mother kept one of Elena's interviews on the refrigerator. Ruth, of course, clipped every article and mailed them to relatives with unnecessary commentary. The real moment of peace came one evening nearly a year after the birthday dinner, when Elena stood alone in the office she had once only dreamed about. It was a bright space with glass walls, too many plants, and a view of the city she had watched from a basement window for years. Her name was on the wall now, not because someone gave it to her, but because she had built a reason for it to belong there. She looked out at the skyline and thought about the girl her family had called lazy. The girl they said needed a husband before she could be meaningful. The girl they had underestimated so completely that they had mistaken silence for weakness. She was not that girl anymore. A soft knock came at the door. Elena turned. It was her mother. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her mother smiled faintly and said, "You look happy." Elena considered the question, then nodded. "I think I finally am." Her mother stepped inside, looking around like she was entering a place that belonged to a stranger and a daughter at the same time. "Your father asked me to tell you he understands if you don't want to see him for a while." Elena let out a small breath. "That's probably the first respectful thing he's said to me in years." Her mother smiled sadly. "He's trying. Trying matters," Elena said. "But it doesn't erase what happened." "No," her mother agreed. "It doesn't." They stood together for a moment in the quiet office. Then her mother said, almost in a whisper. I should have defended you sooner. Elena looked at her for a long time. There were so many versions of that sentence she could have answered with. Anger, hurt, the old sharpness that had kept her alive. But in the end, she chose honesty. Yes, she said. You should have. Her mother nodded, tears shining in her eyes. Elena didn't soften the truth. She didn't need to. Some apologies do not need rescue. They need space. When her mother reached for her hand, Elena let her. Not because the past vanished, not because the wounds were gone, but because healing, she had learned, was not the same as pretending nothing had happened. Healing was telling the truth and then deciding what kind of life you would build around it. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, Elena finally understood that success had never been the real victory. Being seen had been. The people who had called her lazy had not just been wrong. They had been lazy themselves. Too lazy to ask who she was, too greedy to care, too prideful to imagine a daughter could become more than the role they assigned her. But they had made one mistake that changed everything. They had underestimated a woman with nothing left to prove. And by the time they realized what she had built in silence, it was already too late. Elena Carter had been treated like a footnote in her own family story. Now the story belonged to her.